Good morning, everyone, and welcome to those who are joining us online. I'll be talking today about continuous manufacturing for drug product, and I'm going to be presenting some examples as I'm going through my presentation to illustrate some of the concepts about continuous manufacturing. This is an outline of my talk with the introduction, and then I'm going to talk about some of the unique aspects for implementation of continuous manufacturing in pharmaceutical industry, and the control strategy considerations, which are unique for continuous manufacturing, as well as some of the facility considerations. Learning objectives for the talk would be to be able to describe the operational control strategy differences between batch and continuous manufacturing, and explain the importance of material control for continuous manufacturing process. Also be able to identify factors impacting mixing dynamics, in-process measurements, and most importantly, recognize the role of pharmaceutical quality system in a continuous manufacturing environment. You've seen this schematic in the previous presentation and for talking about the illustrating the typical manufacturing process using batch processing. And from a quality perspective, besides having discrete unit operations, in a typical batch manufacturing setting, you see that the in-process material are collected and typically tested at the end of each unit operation before moving on to the next step. And usually the whole time between the individual steps would allow for investigation in case you end up with some out of specification results or something. In contrast, when you're working in a continuous manufacturing environment, you see that all the unit operations are integrated, so material is constantly generated over time, and it's constantly flowing from one part of the line to the other. So there isn't really much time to do the typical offline testing that you would do with a batch process. And so it's important to monitor the process during processing, and that would generate a data-rich manufacturing environment, which really heightens the quality assurance for this type of manufacturing processes because of the constant monitoring that is taking place. So for continuous manufacturing, there are different platforms that can be used and I'm focusing today on solid dosage forms. So you can be operating using a continuous direct compression line, continuous dry granulation line, or continuous wet granulation line. And so the different processes can be implemented, and depending on the type of equipment of the same or different operating principles would be used. For example, a tablet compression step by nature is a continuous process, so that wouldn't change much between a batch manufacturing versus a continuous manufacturing. Whereas when we talk about a blender, for example, or a wet granulation equipment, in a continuous manufacturing environment, an equipment of different design would be needed to be able to integrate those with other equipment upstream and downstream. And also with continuous manufacturing, you see on top of the schematic, those are feeders which constantly feed material through the line. So because of the integrated nature and the fact that any disturbances in the process could propagate throughout the line, there are different control strategy considerations that are necessary for an integrated continuous manufacturing process compared to a batch process. So in this slide, I'll try to summarize some of the unique aspects for CM implementation, and I'll be touching on those throughout the presentation. So we can think of it in four different categories in terms of process design, control strategy, batch and lot definition, as well as facility implementation. So for process design, you're talking about engineering design for the line, how the dynamics work throughout the manufacturing line, what's the equipment configuration, ensuring that the material flows seamlessly from one part of the line to another. Control strategy considerations would encompass everything starting from raw materials going on to process parameters in process controls, and also what happens during startup and shutdown of the process, and when your product is in a state of control that you're able to collect good quality product. Batch and lot definition, we'll go over that, and then also the facility implementation, because that's a very important aspect for continuous manufacturing. So I'll just leave it there, and then I'll be talking about some of those as I'm going through my slides. First, it's important to talk about the control strategy and what it means to have a state of control. So it's like control strategy is having a planned set of controls derived from product and process understanding to ensure product performance and product quality. So a comprehensive control strategy would encompass material attributes for drug substance and drug product components, because those play an important role in a continuous manufacturing environment, especially when you think about material needing to flow through the line. So material attributes become very important. Facility and equipment operating conditions would be also for implementing the continuous operation in process controls, finished product specifications, as well as the methods that are used for monitoring and the frequency of monitoring. As I said, CM requires different control strategy than batch processes. And in this slide, we can see there are different levels of controls that could be implemented typically in a manufacturing environment. And those, depending on the level of product and process understanding, they would offer different levels of flexibility, operational flexibility, depending on how much understanding you have and what level of control that you have during manufacturing. So level 1, which is the highest level, involves having an active control system that is able to have real-time monitoring of the process variables and quality attributes, provide feedback and feed-forward information. So you're able to control the outcome of the manufacturing process at a very high level. Another level, level 2, is when you're operating within established ranges. So you establish the process parameter ranges that you should operate within, and you've understood the multivariate nature of the interaction between process variables and formulation variables, and you also confirm that with final testing. And then level 3, which relies heavily on end product testing, this is unlikely to be feasible for continuous manufacturing. As I explained at the beginning, because of the constant flow of material through the line, it's very hard to assure the quality throughout manufacturing over hours of operation just by doing the end product testing. So when thinking about the control strategy, the more likely is the level 1 and level 2 type of implementation. So one of the things I mentioned at the beginning was the impact of raw material attributes. And this is a complex concept because of the multitude of material attributes that could impact a product or process performance. So for example, when we think about powder properties, we can think of particle size distribution, shape, density, friction, flow function, and then this is also compounded with the type of API that is used. For example, the BCS classification. Is it poorly soluble? Is it highly soluble? The process and product design, what's the drug load in the formulation, how the process dynamics work. So when you think of all this, this all can interact and impact the product performance. So how do we go about characterizing material attributes and what's important for continuous manufacturing? When we think about, we recommend using a risk-based approach in establishing the criteria for raw materials, because depending on the process and product design, there could be different attributes that play different roles in each of those cases. So you want to understand the product and the process, and using criticality and risk analysis, understand what type of material attributes that could impact the process, and then how to control those to ensure consistency in product quality. So this is an example here for a direct compression line. You see on top, you have multiple feeders that feed the individual components that go into a promo or like for screening of material, and then into a continuous blender, followed by feeding of other set of materials, another blending step, and then finally going through the tablet press. So when we think about what type of material attributes would matter at each of those stages, at stage 1, even with the feeders, you have the hopper. The hopper design would be impacted, would impact the flow of material depending on the bulk density and the wall friction with the material of the hopper. The cohesive nature of the material would also impact the material flow to the next step. So those would be important to characterize and make sure that the material are suitable for this type of operation. The feeders, you have there are different designs for the feeders, the screw elements of the feeder. Different materials require different types of screw elements that can facilitate the flow of material continuously from the feeder. So you could think of the feeding step analogous to the weighing of material in a batch process and dispensing that for manufacturing. In the continuous manufacturing environment, the feeding is constantly providing the right composition of all the components of the formulation through the line. So it's very important to ensure that the feeder design works well with the material properties that are used in the formulation. And also the refill during the feeding operation can impact the variability of the feed rate, so that also is something to be considered. Then moving on to the mixer, when doing the process dynamic studies, which I'll be talking about later, the material properties become important because the tracers that you use for characterizing the mixing dynamics have to be similar to that of the formulation, otherwise they would not be representative of the dynamics of flow of material through the line. And of course, the tablet press, typically, which is similar to a batch process, the flow properties would affect the tablet weight variability, so that's no different from a batch process. So like I said, material control, material attribute control is important for continuous feeding and also for developed PAT models. During continuous manufacturing, typically PAT is used for monitoring of the process, and those types of spectroscopic techniques that may be used are impacted by material properties. So if there are differences in material properties between the material that was used for development, for example, versus those that are used during commercial manufacturing, then you could expect that this might impact not only the feeding process into the line, but also could impact those models that were developed during development. And the predictability of these models could be compromised. So when developing those models, you also need to take material properties into consideration. And one of the important things about material attributes is that because of the limited experience during development regarding the extent of variation in material properties. So during development, usually you use a limited number of lots of materials, but then when you go into the commercial manufacturing arena, then you are using more lots with more variability, and that could impact the accuracy and precision of material feeding through the line. It could impact the mixing dynamics. So if you're using models to predict the mixing dynamics, that could impact the accuracy of these models. And as I said, also the predictability of in-process PAT models that are used. And the critical thing is that the potential drug product critical quality attributes that would be impacted by this type of disturbance would be the assay of the product, the content uniformity, and the solution, which are all critical for the performance of the drug product. And this is a diagram which was from another presentation, but it really nicely illustrates the concept of lot-to-lot variation over a product life cycle. If you look at the horizontal line at the very top, this could represent the USP limits for excipients, which is typically very wide. And then as you move down, you see that during R&D development, the experience is limited with a lot-to-lot variability, and you're operating within a small range, which is, you get reasonable results and no problems there. As you move to initial launch and long-term commercial experience, you start seeing an expansion in the extent of variability of material attributes, and then out of specification results might be seen. So having a good understanding about how those material attributes could impact the process and the product and what attributes need to be controlled would be very important. And we can't expect that compendial specifications would be adequate for excipients just for continuous manufacturing. There might be a need for an additional level of control internally to ensure that the product and process are not impacted over the product life cycle. So, as I said, compendial specifications may not always provide adequate material control. It's important to understand the impact of material attributes during development, and then to develop procedures within the firm's pharmaceutical quality system to monitor incoming material loss. We understand that you may not necessarily have control over the extent of variation in material attributes during development. You would likely see more variation as you move to commercial manufacturing, but at least having that level of understanding and internal control could guard against unexpected or undesirable results during commercial operation. So I talked about system dynamics, and it's an important part of process development for continuous manufacturing. And the term system dynamics is typically synonymous with residence time distribution, which is really the probability distribution of material at any given time inside the different parts of the manufacturing line. So residence time distribution, or short for RTD, it's a characterization tool for system dynamics. And from literature, we know that it depends on material properties. So material properties can affect the system dynamics. Process parameters, if you're operating using different throughput rates, for example, that would impact the residence time distribution, and also the equipment configuration. And the graph on the right shows different residence time distributions. We see a narrow distribution and then a broad distribution, which indicates more back mixing and more dispersion of material throughout the line, which means it takes longer for the material to move from one part of the line to the next. And that becomes important if you have any diversion of unacceptable material, for example, during operation, to understand what's the residence time and how long it takes to reach a certain point at which you're going to divert that material and then continue the operation. So what are the applications of residence time distribution in continuous manufacturing? It helps in evaluating equipment design and configuration. As I said, it's impacted by process parameters, so optimizing the process parameters that could be used, or even the impeller design, for example, in a blender or a granulator, could be done through RTD studies. It also helps to evaluate response to set point changes, and so assess how much filtering of variability happens downstream. And if you look at the graph there, you can see that the set point changes are represented by the blue line. And with each set point change, with each increase in the concentration, the orange trace shows that the extent of variation over time downstream of that is not the same extent because of the filtering capacity of downstream equipment. So it also helps track material disturbances and also support the sampling strategy during process monitoring, and support the accept and reject decisions during operation. Because, for example, if you know that a certain variation in the feed rate, because of knowing the residence time distribution, it results in unacceptable level of one of the ingredients in the formulation, you know how long it will take to reach a certain point and how much time you need to divert this material before you resume the collection of product. So it's a very important concept in development and in control strategy as well. One of the questions that usually come up with continuous manufacturing is how is the batch size defined in continuous manufacturing? And when we look at the regulatory definition of a batch and the lot, we see that some of the wording that's in bold, it indicates that it's intended to have a uniform character and quality, and it's produced according to a single manufacturing order during the same cycle of manufacturing. And the same similarly for lots. So as we see from the regulatory definition, there is no distinction between a batch or lot regarding the method of manufacturing. But when we think about a batch size for continuous manufacturing, it's an advantage because you are able to have a flexible batch size depending on the demand for your product, for example. But it has to be defined a priori. You cannot just go in and see how much you're going to get of the product. So it has to be defined. And the way it's defined can be as a function of different things. It can be as a function of runtime, quantity of processed material, any other product variation, for example, lots of material used. And so having a proper batch definition is important for proper documentation, to be able to conform to batch release specification investigations, and also in case of recalls in which it has to be traced back to a certain batch. Also, when we talk about batch, it's important to understand what the relationship between batch size definition and the control strategy. Because in a state of control, this is the time when you want to be collecting product. So you have to be operating in a state of control, and during that time, you're able to collect good quality product. So when you think about certain events during the manufacturing, such as at startup and shutdown, not all the unit operations within a continuous manufacturing line would be in a state of control. It takes time for all of the unit operations to be operating within the desired range that you have set up for the process. So it's important also when you're developing your continuous manufacturing process to describe the startup and shutdown procedures and what you're going to do during that time regarding product disposition, and also have a clear criteria for product disposition. So when do you start collecting product, when do you stop collecting product, and when do you have to divert material when you're not within a state of control. Real-time release testing is a useful tool during continuous manufacturing because it relies on process data and measured material attributes and process controls to be able to evaluate and ensure the quality of the final product. So because of the data-rich environment that typically happens with continuous manufacturing, real-time release testing becomes very beneficial. It enhances product understanding, and it increases the assurance of quality, and also increases manufacturing flexibility and efficiency because you're able to operate in the continuous mode and then also be able to still ensure the quality of the product that is manufactured. There are some design considerations when thinking about in-process sampling, for whether it's for in-process monitoring or for real-time release testing. It's important to choose the optimum points of testing and collecting model input parameters based on risk assessment. So thinking about the continuous manufacturing line, where are the critical control points that I need to monitor during operation? If I'm looking at uniformity, for example, does it change after that point or not? So those are also other considerations for in-process sampling. Sampling strategy has to be supported by system dynamics, and then making sure that the sampling interface is not fouled during operation by powder accumulation, for example, and that you are sampling a representative mass or volume of material over time. For the PAT method, if it's, for example, a spectroscopic method, appropriate model development and validation is expected. There is a guidance for near IR that goes into details about what data to be submitted for this type of method, its impact on the product, on the overall control strategy, and what are the procedures in the quality system of the firm that ensures that the model is up to date and that any triggers for model update are adequately handled. Also routine maintenance and of instruments and addressing instrument failures. Finally, I'd like just to spend a couple minutes on the facility considerations for continuous manufacturing. There is a need to adjust the PQS system to the existing, the adjustments to the existing pharmaceutical quality system because of the nature of continuous manufacturing, and so updates to the quality and production procedures are important. How the PQS, the quality unit, oversees the automated controls, the process data that's generated, the electronic records that are used. Also, what happens when material is diverted and quarantined, how is that handled through the quality system, handling deviations and investigations, the process validation and demonstrating readiness for commercial manufacturing, managing knowledge, all this data that's generated over time, and then also the integration of the equipment train, how the equipment are qualified, on site, and then the cleaning validation is an important element also of the facility implementation. And finally, as we talked at the beginning about any additional controls for incoming raw materials that would be necessary. So in summary, I just like to emphasize that FDA supports the implementation of continuous manufacturing, but we expect science and control strategy considerations. It has to be risk-based to ensure that the quality of the product is maintained irrespective of the submission type, it's new drugs or generics. Also, importance of the role of the pharmaceutical quality system in continuous manufacturing. So now to the challenge questions. First question, I think I emphasized that when I was talking. Compendial specifications of excipients provide adequate control of material attributes for continuous manufacturing. True or false? Okay, great. Second question, residence time distribution as a characterization tool of mixing dynamics depends on material properties, process parameters, equipment configuration, or all of the above. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.